Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News Weekend. The 2021 election is over, and we're not far from where we began 5 weeks ago. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party were re-elected to a minority government on Monday. With possibly 2 years until the next federal election, Canada is asking what's next. Here's Lindsay Richardson with the latest on the Liberal Party's outlook.
There's no rest for the re-elected. In a post-election tradition, Justin Trudeau greeted supporters at a metro station in his Montreal riding of Papineau Tuesday morning. An appearance made mere hours after calling victory at Liberal headquarters, closing out a $600 million roundabout election.
Some have talked about division, but that's not what I see. That's not what I've seen these past weeks across the country. I see Canadians standing together in your determination to end this pandemic, together for real climate action, for $10 a day childcare, for homes that are in reach for middle-class families.
And not to forget,
for our shared journey on the path of reconciliation.
The Liberal Party fell just short of a majority government, and although some cabinet ministers lost their seats, former Indigenous Affairs Minister Mark Miller held his in the Ville-Marie riding for a third consecutive term.
I look at it with some sobriety and say to myself, this is the trust that Canadians place in us. Parliament is a place that is not without review and criticism and opposition, and it makes the country that I think is the greatest in the world thrive.
Though this exercise in status quo is technically over, ballots are still being counted, a cabinet shuffle is impending, and all eyes will be on the upcoming throne speech. But for the moment,
let us feel the warmth of a new dawn, and above all, let us seize the promise of a brand new day. Merci, mes amis. Thank you, my friends. Merci tout le monde.
Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Justin Trudeau promised Indigenous people radical change in 2015. Well, has he lived up to that pledge? And has the pace of change been swift enough? Brett Forrester caught up with Indigenous leaders to ask. Brett has more from Ottawa.
For National Chief Roseanne Archibald, the election results showed people want stability, at least while the pandemic continues. But that doesn't mean she's happy with the status quo.
You know, the slowness of progress really means it's costing us lives. It's costing the suffering of our children. And I think we've got to get together and have a meaningful partnership with all parties, because it is a minority government, and figure out that healing path forward.
Indigenous leaders and Justin Trudeau have had positive relationships over the last 6 years. David Chartrand is the Vice President of the Métis National Council, and he's pleased with the pace of change under the Liberals.
Right now, I know for a fact there's never been a Prime Minister that has devoted so much time to Indigenous files. It's not perfect, I'll tell you that. There's still things to do. But how do you expect everybody to solve 150 years, 200 years in that 4 or 5 year span?
But the Native Women's Association of Canada disagreed. CEO Lynn Grew said that the Liberal government's approach must shift, even if the government still looks the same.
So they made a lot of promises, and they need to keep those promises if there's going to be trust, with us, and we're going to believe anything that they say.
The leaders may disagree on Trudeau's track record, but they all promise to keep pressuring him to act. They'll be watching closely as he names his cabinet and issues them a new mandate in the coming weeks. Brett Forrester, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Former Department of Fisheries Minister Bernadette Jordan failed to be re-elected on Monday. That didn't stop supporters of the Mi'kmaq Treaty Fishery from taking action on Thursday. Angel Moore reports on a demonstration in front of DFO's Atlantic headquarters in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia.
Supporters and Mi'kmaq fishers gathered in front of DFO headquarters. Mateo Labrador of the Acadia First Nation organized the event.
DFO needs to be stopped. The government needs to be stopped. It's it's come down to we have to take our land back. We're taking it back. We're taking our waters back.
Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters treaty fishing have had their gear seized and been arrested by DFO officers. The department says the Mi'kmaq are violating the Fisheries Act. Matt Cope of Millbrook First Nation had over 60 traps seized last year and is now facing charges.
They want to not honor the obligations and the treaties that they made, and I think it's absolutely ridiculous, and I think it's nothing short than an act of war.
Noah Johnson of Bois-de-Ladec First Nation says the fisheries officers are aggressive.
So it's honestly to the point I think the Mi'kmaq fishermen and fisherwomen are going to take action into their own hands. We are not safe from the government of Nova Scotia. They criminalized our treaties.
The Mi'kmaq fishers say they will continue to assert their treaty rights. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Jabukduk, also known as Halifax.
The Fairy Creek dispute over old-growth logging has been going on now for more than a year, and the arrests continue. This week, lawyers for the logging company and protesters battled over a possible extension of the injunction against blockades. We look back now at how this protest on Vancouver Island developed. APTN's Lee Wilson has that story.
There is nothing sweet or gentle about the wreckage you've witnessed around here.
There have now been over 1,000 arrests in Fairy Creek in the dispute over old-growth logging on Vancouver Island.
Our determination to protect the old growth, that is now becoming exposed to the whole world.
The protest started in May of 2020 when recreational users and environmental groups learned of road building for logging in Fairy Creek. Surrey-based logging company Teal Jones has a 25-year agreement for Tree Farm License 46 with the province of BC, signed in 2012. They also have a revenue-sharing agreement with Bechedat First Nation. Fairy Creek falls in their traditional territory. The First Nation band has under 300 members. A Bechedat elder, Bill Jones, opposed the logging of old growth in Fairy Creek. He became one of the leaders of the protest. Late in 2020, Teal Jones sought an injunction to the BC Supreme Court to remove the blockades. This April, the company's injunction was granted. The Bechedat First Nation leadership released a statement asking the protesters to leave. We do not welcome or support unsolicited involvement or interference by others in our territory, including third-party activism. More blockades went up in the nearby Sykes and Carmina-Walbrand regions. There was a call on social media for others to come protect old-growth forests, with Elder Bill Jones leading the way. In mid-May, RCMP started enforcing the injunction. They set up an injunction zone, and the rest began. Escalation of the conflict between RCMP and land defenders increased. In June, 3 Vancouver Island nations, the Haiyut, Dididat, and Bechedat, announced a declaration or a land agreement with the province. It included a 2-year deferral on the Fairy Creek watershed and part of the Carmina-Walbrand regions. They also called for the blockades of other approved logging areas to stop. The nations ask, while work is underway, everyone allow forestry operations in other parts of the territories approved by the nations and the province to continue without disruption. But the protesters kept the blockades. Joshua Wright has been at Fairy Creek since the start. He states people there want province-wide deferrals of old growth and permanent protection.
Talk and talk and talk, and meanwhile, over 1,000 people have been arrested trying to defend these forests, and the last sections of these ancient forests are falling. And I mean, this is an extinction of an ecosystem that we are facing.
While Teal Jones did agree to stop logging for the 2-year deferral in Fairy Creek, the deferrals don't apply to old growth in areas around Fairy Creek, including an area known as Granite Creek. In an email statement to APTN News, the Ministry of Forests stated those areas are not included in the deferrals. The areas identified in the photo are outside the Fairy Creek watershed and are a part of Tree Farm License 46.
We're in the generation now, and our
elders and leaders from other First Nations around the province have come to Fairy Creek to support the blockades. There have also been calls from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs to protect old growth. This week, the logging company Teal Jones appeared in court to extend the injunction against blockading the roads in Fairy Creek for 1 year. Lawyers representing the protesters are arguing against the extension. citing the climate crisis.
It's not enough to say, oh, we're not going to log this one forest. We need to say we're not going to log old-growth forests because we are in a climate emergency. And you do not log the biggest carbon sinks you have in a climate emergency.
The BC Supreme Court does not expect to make a decision on the extension of the injunction until late in September. Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Kitimat.
A new monument honoring the murdered and missing has been unveiled in the Yukon. That story and more coming up after the break. Welcome back. In honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people, a new monument was unveiled in Whitehorse last week. As Sarah Connors tells us, the piece will serve as a source of healing and reflection for all Yukoners.
She's a symbol of the women and girls whose lives were taken. Dozens of people gathered at this park in Whitehorse to honor and remember missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people.
Today, we gather to support one another, and it is a day where we visually recognize a painful truth in our community.
At the heart of this ceremony was this monument, an Indigenous woman beating a drum. A commemoration project led by the Yukon Aboriginal Women's Circle and several other partners. Titled Finding Peace, the monument will serve as a place of healing for families to remember the daughters, mothers, and sisters no longer here today.
The legacy of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a stain on our history and continues to impact our present reality here in the Yukon and throughout the country.
How you can support.
There were several speeches at the public ceremony, including one from Kwanlin Dun First Nation Chief Doris Bill, who had a call to action to politicians in the crowd.
I want you to support initiatives like this. I want to see statues like this across Canada, not just the Yukon. I think it's time.
Others included an impromptu speech from the artist behind the monument.
I would say that the statue, I didn't make the statue, we made this statue. And I hope that people, when they look at it, that it touched their heart, that it, it gives them peace.
Adeline Weber worked on the monument's planning committee. She hopes it will raise awareness about MMIWG2S+.
It's an opportunity for the general public to become aware of the history and to begin to ask questions about when they see a monument like this, like, why is it here?
The monument is also part of the territory's recently released action plan to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people. Jeannie McLean is the minister responsible for the Women and Gender Equity Directorate. She says one action in the strategy is commemoration.
We have courageous. The monument is really symbolic, and because it's that physical presence, that we are digging into the strategy.
A symbol of the women and girls gone, but not forgotten.
And that's what that symbolizes to me. We will never forget, and we will work to prevent this from happening in the future and to change the story.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
In southern Ontario, the province's lieutenant governor and Canada's first Indigenous appeals court judge were among the trailblazing volunteers, community members, and allies honored at Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. APTN's Elena McDougall was there.
I've always tried to do everything that I could to help anybody or everybody.
Members and friends of Mississaugas of Credit First Nation, or MCFN, were recognized with Eagle Awards at an outdoor ceremony just outside Brantford recently. Ontario's Lieutenant General Elizabeth Dowdeswell was among honored guests and award recipients.
We always want to
thank those who do so much for us, whether they're members or whether they're allies or whether they're friends. And we haven't been doing that enough, so we came up with the awards.
Carol Tobacco received the 2021 Volunteer Award for decades spent devoted to events and preservation of history and culture.
Well, I never really expected to get something like this, but it's nice to know that people do appreciate what you have done, and something that I can look back on, and I'm glad that I have done all those things in the community.
Other recipients included the late educator Carl King, rights advocate Joanne Webb, historian Jane Beecroft, and the first Indigenous person to sit on the Ontario Court of Appeal, Justice Harry Laforme, who was born and raised at Mississaugas of Credit.
So the fact that this honor comes from my own community, as it does, is about as special, I think, as anybody can get, and certainly special for me. It's humbling. It will be a source of pride forever.
The community is hopeful next year's awards will be unrestricted so all members and friends can attend.
But the awards help us to remember who we are and where we belong, and we belong everywhere.
Elena McDougall, APTN National News, Mississaugas of Credit First Nation.
The city of Whitehorse is hoping to host the largest sporting event in Canada. The city has officially launched the 2027 Canada Winter Games bid process. It will take 13 months to complete. The Games could generate millions for the local economy and build new infrastructure in the territory. Whitehorse previously hosted the event in 2007, which drew more than 5,000 visitors. The Council of Yukon First Nations Grand Chief says the Games are a great opportunity for young, aspiring athletes.
Our youth need something positive now that they can not only, like I said, build towards, but also the importance of building leadership and prosperity and success.
It was 20 years ago that the memorial to Indigenous veterans was unveiled in downtown Ottawa. Adrian Clarkson was Governor General at the time. This week it was Mary Simon's turn to lay a wreath at the foot of the monument. She's the first Indigenous person to become the Queen's representative in Canada. She paid her respects to Indigenous peacekeepers and soldiers, past, present, and future. People like Chief Wendy Jacko, who is a veteran and comes from a family of veterans.
And we do remember the soldiers who fought for our freedom and values, who served far from home in peacekeeping missions and in horrific wars.
And my own little grandson, Keenan, has mentioned as well that he would also like to join the military. So throughout our history, we have been a family of military people. So it's been a great pleasure to be here today to join my colleagues and my friends for the 20th anniversary of this memorial dedicated to Aboriginal veterans.
There's a big sale on polar bear hides in Nunavut this weekend. We'll tell you why after the break. Welcome back. Starting this weekend, Nunavut residents will have a chance to buy a heavily discounted polar bear skin. Why? Well, partly market forces and partly because Inuit knowledge says don't waste anything. Here's Ken Driscoll.
Nunavut's Environment Department had a problem. These polar bear hides were waiting for years to be sold at auction. The government pays the harvesters a deposit and then sells the fur at auction. These furs weren't selling.
And with the demand being so low, it didn't look like they were going to be sold at any point. Not because they're bad hides, they're just a little bit smaller, a little bit poorer quality than those international buyers are looking for.
Why aren't these furs selling? The market's influenced by many factors, but the buyers were shook for a particular reason.
Several years ago, polar bears were up to become a higher level of protection than they currently are under the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. So where it almost was uplisted to a point where there'd be no international export of polar bears at all. So there was just a couple years where the international buyers kind of pumped the brakes because they were worried that if they were to purchase the hides, they'd be unable to export them out of Canada.
If the market hadn't have crashed, there would be a market for these furs. But for now, buyers are only interested in the highest quality. The roughly 200 hides are being sold at discount to Nunavut. Depending on size and quality, they'll cost anywhere between $200 and $800. These hides have had the flesh removed and have been dried, but not tanned. They aren't the kind of hide you'd want to hang up on your wall, but polar bear fur has a lot of uses. From mitts to pants, Nunavut craftspeople will turn these hides into something new.
Since it hasn't been tanned or processed or anything like that, people might want to use it for clothing. People who do crafts and whatnot, might be able to purchase one and use several different parts of the hide for different crafts and stuff like that.
The hides go live for sale on September 28th. The first half will be made available to Inuit first. After that, all Nunavut will have a shot at them. What international buyers feared is to the benefit of Nunavut's craftspeople. Those hides might not sell in the south, but Nunavut will find a way to use them. Ken Driscoll, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
A radio station in Manitoba is celebrating its 50th birthday. Native Communications Incorporated started its half-century journey in Thompson, and it is still going strong all over. APTN's Michelle Karlenzig caught up with General Manager David McLeod at the celebration.
NCIFM hit the airwaves in Manitoba in 1971, when Indigenous voices in media were lacking. Today, the country music station hit 50 years on the air. CEO David McLeod has been there since day one. He says there's a lot to celebrate.
Why did people like NCI? Because people can reflect, they can hear themselves, they know the community. There doesn't need to be an explanation, there's a lot known.
The station started in the northern city of Thompson. It grew quickly into a network of 57 transmitters across the province, funded by a weekly radio bingo program. Don McIver was instrumental in getting the whole thing started.
And I think that's what's so important about the Indigenous voice and the Indigenous stories, is that when it comes from our community, there's a different grasp and understanding, particularly when it comes to language as well, and culture and all those other things.
A celebration at the radio station saw Indigenous music, an unveiling of a mural by local artist Jordan Stranger, and tons of trips down memory lane. McLeod credits community members for keeping NCI alive and well all these years.
At the end of the day, it's not about equipment. It's not about the technical part. It's about connecting with people.
You can find NCIFM at 105.5 on your FM radio dial. Michelle Karlenzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
And a big congrats to NCI from all of us. That's all the time we have for your APTN National News for this weekend. For news anytime, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.